I was asked to think about and to talk with you about what the 19th century made of Shakespeare, and particularly what the Victorians made of Shakespeare. Now, that is an absolutely immense topic. So we could have thought about production. What was 19th century theatre like? What sort of performances did actors put in across the century? How did they change? What were the staging approaches to Shakespeare? We could think about 19th century criticism or editing of Shakespeare. Particularly the Romantics, Coleridge, Hazlitt, were great Shakespeare critics. I mean, huge advances in thinking about Shakespeare. Thomas de Quincey. We could have thought about 19th century writers alluding to Shakespeare or working with Shakespeare. And that, in a sense, gets us closer to what I am going to talk about. What I decided to do was to focus on the most influential and the most radical art movement of the Victorian period. So this is the Pre-Raphaelites. I'll explain in a minute a little bit who they were. But what I want to show you over the course of this lecture is how this one group of artists in the mid-19th century, so 1850s essentially we're looking at, 1840s, 1850s, engaged with Shakespeare's plays, and particularly how they engaged with Shakespeare's heroines within his plays, because that is where we're going to see a sustained artistic, intellectual, thoughtful engagement. We're also going to see that this is not just a matter of painting, because the Pre-Raphaelites, although they begin as an art movement or are mainly thought of as a pictorial movement, were actually involved in several other arts as well, poetry particularly, but also sculpture, although actually you'll get a tiny glimpse of Pre-Raphaelite Shakespearean sculpture in this, but mainly it's going to be painting plus poetry. So, to start off with, who were the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood? They were a group of 7 art students. They were all in their late teens, early 20s. Most of them were students at the Royal Academy schools in London. The Royal Academy was the leading establishment art school in the country. And this is the men themselves. They were all men, although as we'll see, their circle included a number of women artists. We're going to look at one of them in particular, artists and poets. But the core, perhaps unsurprisingly for a mid-Victorian movement, the core was a group of young men. Of them, 5 of them were painters. So of this list here, Collinson, Hunt, Millais, Dante Gabriel Rosetti and Frederick George Stevens were all art students, painting students. Thomas Woolner was a sculptor, and William Michael Rosetti was Dante Gabriel Rosetti's little brother, and he wanted to involve him. So he wasn't actually an art student. But all of them practiced the visual arts in some way or another, drawing, painting, sculpture. All of them wrote poetry to differing degrees as well. What's significant about them? Why were they the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood? They essentially wanted to launch an aesthetic revolt against the teachings of the Royal Academy. And particularly, they objected to the principle that the way to learn to be a great artist was to copy the great art of the past. So the Royal Academy instruction involved a lot of learning the principles according to which Raphael, the great Italian Renaissance painter, worked, and subsequent painters, copying Roman sculpture, for instance, and basically working on the assumption that you could just replicate the forms, particularly the compositional forms of earlier art, and that's the way to produce great painting. Now the Pre-Raphaelites turned around and they said, well, this is nonsense. The artist should look for himself, or herself as it comes later on as well. The role of the artist is to see and to perceive and to be original. Otherwise art is just replication. It's just kind of gets fixed, gets stuck, gets static. They call themselves the Pre-Raphaelites then, for 2 reasons actually. One is because they were looking back before Raphael, not because they didn't like Raphael's art, they did, not because they thought that they wanted to copy the artists from before Raphael, they didn't. But they thought that the artists before Raphael were still seeing with their own eyes. Art hadn't become a series of entrenched practices by that point. So that's why they called themselves Pre-Raphaelite. The other reason was a joke, because they could sign paintings, PRB, and the only person who could sign PRA was the president of the Royal Academy. So PRB was a kind of impudent little quip against them. The other thing that they looked to, as well as early Italian art as a model, was science and the language of science, and the idea that you should study things empirically for yourselves. And that kind of idea of investigation is something we'll come to through their engagement with Shakespeare in a minute. So that's the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. They were founded in 1848. The artists we're going to look at today, actually only one of them was a member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. That's John Everett Millais. The others are associates, if you like, people in their circle. So Arthur Hughes was a younger artist who fell in with the Pre-Raphaelites in the 1850s. Elizabeth Siddal was first a model and then a poet and an artist in her own right, who ended up married to Dante Gabriel Rosetti. They were lovers for a long time before that. Walter Deverell and John Lucas Tupper were other members of their close circle in the 1840s and 50s. Alfred Tennyson is there because Millais engages with Shakespeare through Tennyson in one of the paintings we're looking at. This gives you just a little plan for the lecture. So we're going to look at 3 plays, or 3 examples from plays, heroines from plays, and the ways in which they were treated by these particular Pre-Raphaelite artists in turn. So let's start with Ophelia. And let's start indeed with the most famous, probably of all Pre-Raphaelite paintings. How many of you have seen this painting before? Quite a few of you, not all of you. It's probably the most iconic of their paintings. As you're studying in Birmingham, the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery has one of the best collections of Pre-Raphaelite work in the world. In fact, probably the biggest in the world and one of the best. So sometime over the course of your 3 years here, take the chance to go and have a look. There's some really splendid stuff. Probably not just now, because I think it's still on tour in America, earning cash for for the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, BMAG. But soon, go and have a look. This painting's actually in the Tate. This painting isn't in Birmingham. But we're going to start with this, because it's one of a whole series of Pre-Raphaelite engagements with the figure of Ophelia. It's the first one. And one of the things I want to ask and investigate is what it was about Ophelia that drew the Pre-Raphaelites to her. And what did they see? What did they come to understand about Ophelia? Or how did they come to conceive of Ophelia through their artistic explorations of her as a character? There are 2 scenes in Hamlet that they particularly drew attention to. The first is Act 4, Scene 2, which is known as Ophelia's mad scene. It's the moment where Ophelia has finally broken down under the pressure of mistreatment by Hamlet, exploitation by her father and the court, and she goes mad. And then the second scene is Act 4, Scene 4, which is the moment where Gertrude tells, so the Queen tells Laertes, Ophelia's brother, that she has drowned. And there's a fairly long speech in which she records the drowning or reports the drowning. And a lot of these paintings focus, if you like, on the moments between those 2 scenes, between the first revelation of Ophelia's madness and the consequence of her madness, which is her drowning. So the first of these paintings is Millais, and that captures Ophelia just on the cusp of drowning. She's about to go under the water. She's not yet dead, so this isn't a dead body, this is a dying body. The next one, which is the second one I'm going to talk about in some detail, is Arthur Hughes' first painting of Ophelia. And this one you can see from the image, is that, well, I hope it's clear. I'll show you bigger images later of them. That's Ophelia as she's gathering wild flowers and plants, and she, according to Gertrude, pretty well accidentally falls into the water and drowns. So this is her about to fall in. This is Dante Gabriel Rossetti's first treatment of the subject. This is a moment a little bit earlier in Act 3, Scene 1, where Hamlet confronts Ophelia. This is the famous "Get thee to a nunnery" scene, and you can see the aggression of Hamlet there. You can also see Ophelia turning away from him, trying to kind of back away from him. Hughes returned to the subject in 1864 This one is probably, if you like, moments earlier than the previous Hughes painting. So again, between those two key scenes, Act 4, Scene 2 and Act 4, Scene 4. This is Rosetti again, Act 4, Scene 2. This is the first mad scene. The various other characters gathering round, concerned about her. And then, of course, there are also the very famous paintings, series of paintings by John William Waterhouse, who's a much later painter, who we think of as pre-Raphaelite, although actually he wasn't very closely connected to the movement. But he, again, did several treatments of Ophelia. So why do they keep coming back to Ophelia? And what do they gain from thinking about her? I want to start, as I say, I want to focus on these two earlier paintings. So let's start with Millet. If you have a look at this painting, various things are striking about it, I think, from a pictorial point of view to start with. And these illustrate something, first off, about what the Pre-Raphaelites thought they were doing and were seeking to do. There were two radical innovations that the Pre-Raphaelites brought into art, really. The first was that they rejected the idea that the foreground was what mattered. So according to Royal Academy teaching, what mattered in a painting was the foreground. What you were showing was the figures. The background, you didn't need to pay so much attention to. In fact, you didn't want to pay so much attention to it. It was literally the background. So there was this sort of assumption that as you move through the painting, partly spatially and partly from the figure to the surround, you'd move from greater detail to less detail. But if you look at this, you can see that he's painted the entire scene in absolutely the same level of detail, extraordinary clarity of detail. And his practice in doing this involved standing by a riverbank, that's in Ewell where he painted that, standing by a riverbank for literally more than 3 months, painting directly onto the canvas. No previous artists had been doing this. Previous artists had occasionally painted outdoors, but they'd done sketches outdoors, essentially. Constable, for instance, captured the movement of the clouds and paint by painting directly outdoors. But what nobody had done before was this sustained examination of the natural world and detail. So you've got the effect, which is the detail all the way through, and you've got the practice, which is painting outside. There's other aspects of experimental practice here that are important too, and I'll come to them in a minute. But if we just start by taking this as a scene with Ophelia in it, one of the things that I think you immediately can see is the abundance of plant life. Now, in both of those scenes, Act 14:2, 14:4, Ophelia is associated with flowers, and plants and herbs. She gives out flowers and herbs. She is recorded by Gertrude as having been surrounded by these flowers, picked flowers, as she drowns. So you've got an immediate contrast there between this abundance of wild life and the dying girl, or dying woman, let's say. I'll change that word from girl to woman advisedly, and you'll see why in a minute. You've also got the contrast between the picked flowers, which are, of course, necessarily dying anyway. Any picked flowers are, by virtue of being picked, they begin to die. And the life around. The colour is more, other than green, the colour is more in the picked flowers, whereas the abundance of green life is what you see surrounding her. Okay, so that gives you just set up that picture, as it were. And it shows how far, I hope, that it chimes with a particular pre-Raphaelite principle, which was articulated by William Michael Rosetti in an essay in 1851. And he said that no man is born into the world under obligation to subscribe to the opinions or see according to the perceptions of another. Art represents individual mind and views working from absolute data of fact. So the artist looks for himself. It's that crucial principle. Conventions are just opinions. You should jettison conventions, look for the truth of the matter. And then he uses this word investigation. The Pre-Raphaelites pursue investigation for themselves on all points which have been hitherto settled by example or unproved precept. And they offer unflinching avowal of the result of such investigation. So you can see, I think, how, if you go back to this painting, you can see how there is an investigation of the natural world going on here, according to Pre-Raphaelite principles. But why does it matter that it's Ophelia? What's the investigation of Ophelia herself that's being undertaken here? How is Millais trying to understand her, and indeed to represent her? So I said that he painted the painting outdoors over weeks and weeks and weeks, which he did. He didn't paint the model outdoors because you can't tether your model in a lake and paint her as she slowly drowns. Even if you're incredibly committed to realism, you have to go a little bit more easy on her than that. This is Elizabeth Siddal, who I talked about earlier, and who we're going to come back to in a minute. Now, what Gertrude says, though, in her description of the drowning Ophelia, is she says, and this is to her brother Laertes, she says, her clothes spread wide, and mermaid-like a while they bore her up. What time she chanted snatches of old lords as one incapable of her own distress. And then she goes on to say, this is all from Act 4, Scene 2. Act 4, Scene 4. But long it could not be till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death. Now, what Millais wants to do, and again, what no artist before has thought to do, is to visualize that process by which her clothes drown her. The process by which her clothes, in fact, first of all float up and then are on the cusp of sinking. And so what he did was that he got Elizabeth Siddal to pose in her dress in a large bath of water so that he could actually record the way in which the dress floated, the way in which her hair floated. It's a very famous and quite notorious story because he was such a meticulous painter. He had Elizabeth Siddal in this bath, and he'd set up a lot of tea lights underneath it, you know, those kind of candles, little candles. And it was one of those freestanding Victorian baths, so you could put candles underneath it to keep her warm. But unfortunately, he was so meticulous as a painter that he painted her for 8 hours, during which time, of course, the candles went out. Elizabeth Siddal notoriously caught a chill, and her father, she was a working-class London shop girl, her father came round and demanded money with menaces to pay for the doctor's bills. So it seems kind of quixotic, it seems like sort of absurd, but you can see that actually it isn't really absurd. It's an attempt to see what Gertrude says and to show what Gertrude says. But it's also an investigation, I think, of what Ophelia would look like and what that says about Ophelia's mind at this moment on the cusp of death. One of the things you notice if you look at Pre-Raphaelite drawings, their sketches for the paintings, is that the sketches are often much more melodramatic than the paintings themselves. So if you look at this sketch for the Ophelia painting, you can see that she looks kind of distraught. There's pain and anguish on her face, as you might imagine if you were staging or representing the death, possibly by suicide, of Ophelia. But what happens when you go from the drawing to the painting is that you get a much more complicated presentation of her psychology. She's no longer a figure in sort of a kind of, what's the word, melodramatic action, performing the role of distress. She's instead somebody who is psychologically numbed. She's also physically numbed because she's been in a bath for 8 hours. But that gives you a kind of mapping on of the physical to the psychological. And she's psychologically numbed, which actually chimes with what Gertrude says. Because Gertrude describes her as one incapable of her own distress. So she's not this kind of melodramatic heroine. She's somebody who is not feeling, not fully conscious of the distress that she is herself experiencing or that her body is experiencing. And you can see that in the way her face has changed from the pictures. The way in which she becomes more composed. Not even consciously resigned, I don't think, just physically going under. Numbed to the world. So you've got a probing of her psychology, an attempt to represent her psychology. You've also got, I think, a consideration of some of the social issues here. If you contrast this painting by Millais with another contemporary painting, very famous, called Found Drowned by George Frederick Watts. This painting by Watts is a social commentary. It's very obviously a social commentary. It's underneath the arches of London Bridge, maybe Waterloo Bridge. It's certainly one of the London Thames bridges. And there was seen to be a concern, a problem with so-called fallen women, in other words, women who'd fallen into prostitution, drowning themselves in the Thames. It was a kind of a scare almost, a mid-Victorian scare, an anxiety. And you can see that Watts is immediately calling on our sympathies. You've got this figure who is found drowned and yet is kind of splayed out almost Christ-like in a way. There's a surprising clarity to her features. It's almost a martyrdom picture, maybe, a social martyrdom. And certainly it's very clearly saying social problems lead to the suicides. But what's the cause of Ophelia's death? And how might one view that as a modern painting? Well, obviously, firstly, stylistically, it's radically modern, as I've been telling you, the new Pre-Raphaelite practices. But also look at her dress. It's not, I don't think, self-evidently a piece of historicisation. You could put somebody in very obviously medieval clothing or Renaissance clothing, but Millet hasn't done that. It looks more like a Victorian dress, actually, although it's a little bit unclear because it's waterlogged and so forth. But the laciness of it and so forth suggests that. So there's a hint, perhaps, at this being a modern concern, but it's nowhere near as obvious or overt as in Watts's painting. And if it is a modern concern, well, what is the concern here? What's the agency? Who is responsible for Ophelia's death? We know who's responsible for this woman's death. It's society and exploitation of women, straightforwardly. But what about Ophelia? Is she a victim of a similar exploitation? In one sense, she certainly is. Has she got an element of choice about this? Is this a suicide? Or is it an accident, an accidental death? So you can see, I think, how Millet is using paint and painterly techniques to ask questions about Ophelia, to represent her in a way that she'd never been represented before, to think a little bit about where she's coming from, where she's going. And you can see very, very differently that this is also what Hughes does in his painting, Ophelia. So you've got some superficial similarities, the vividly realised natural landscape, but much, much, much less vividly realised, actually, than Millet's painting. But you've also got some quite stark differences. And I think the mood of the paintings is very different. This represents a different aspect of Pre-Raphaelitism. This is Pre-Raphaelitism not as intense realism, but as imaginative expansion, opening up another possible world, opening a way of thinking imaginatively with characters. The reason I changed my term when I first described Ophelia in Millet's painting as a girl is that this very clearly is Ophelia as a girl. Millet's Ophelia is a woman. This is a girl. She's much younger. She's therefore much more obviously vulnerable. It's a painting that draws our sympathy to her. She's thin. She's pale. She's reaching forward into the canvas, which affects her bodily posture. But even in spite of the fact that she's reaching forward, she looks very tiny. So this is a different way of engaging with Ophelia. It's a way of trying to represent the psychology of the situation, not through this kind of intense gaze of Millet, this scrutiny, these questions being asked, but suggestively. This is to say, this is a girl who we should feel sympathy for, whose vulnerability is patently obvious to our very eyes, whose mental state is perhaps in some way not just tragic madness, but something that is otherworldly, because the painting looks otherworldly. And if you want to contrast it or compare it with a couple of other examples of Pre-Raphaelite treatment from Shakespeare, you can see this otherworldliness as another strand in what they like to think about. So that's Millet's Ferdinand lured by Ariel, which combines the extraordinary detail, particularly detailed observation actually of funguses and grasses and plants, with the fantastical representation of the spirit. And that's the one statue I was going to show you, which is Thomas Woolner's Puck, which is Puck again, represented very tangibly, but as a sort of slightly a kind of impish, demonic, not human, not even performed by a human figure, and on a different scale. So you can see this is another side of Pre-Raphaelitism, is the kind of otherworldliness of the engagement with Shakespeare. And therefore we can say, well, what's happening with Shakespeare here is an expansion of the imagination. They're seeing the magical side, the romantic side, let's say, of Shakespeare. The way in which Shakespeare can open us up, not just to the realities of things, but to other ways of imagining and representing the world, or even thinking of other worlds. I want to take us on to one more engagement with excuse me, Ophelia, before I look at the other two plays that I have in mind. And this is to come back to Elizabeth Siddal herself. So Elizabeth Siddal, as I say, began as a model. Well, she was a milliner, actually. She made hats. Then she was discovered by Walter Deverell, who spotted her in a London street and invited her to model. And she modelled for Deverell, actually in a couple of images from Twelfth Night, which I'll show you in a minute, and for Millais in Ophelia, and for William Holman Hunt, and ultimately most prodigiously and extensively for Dante Gabriel Rosetti. They became lovers. Dante Gabriel Rosetti and she became artistic collaborators. He initially taught her to paint, and then they worked on works together. And he also cultivated, or they together cultivated, a shared interest in poetry. Siddal's biography has dominated perceptions of her, because she's, if you like, a kind of 19th century Sylvia Plath figure, because she has a very fraught relationship with Rosetti. They split up. She clearly goes into a state of depression. Well, actually, probably before they split up. But then they get back together, they marry, and then she dies of a drugs overdose shortly after a miscarriage in 1862. Probably suicide, but one can never be quite sure. So the biography has always conditioned how people see her, and conditioned how people see her art and her poetry. But a recent edition has come out of her poetry, edited by Serena Trowbridge, who's at Birmingham City University. She's done a new edition from manuscript. And Serena, I think, very rightly argues that we must view Siddal as an artist. We shouldn't view her poetry as simply biography. We shouldn't view her art as simply a kind of effusion of her personality, because we wouldn't do that if she were a male artist of the time. We need to accord her the same respect as an artist as we would any of the other members of the Pre-Raphaelite circle. And what I want to suggest to you here is that while one can read her poetry biographically, one can also read it as an engagement with Ophelia, an engagement with that character who she herself had to embody in that early painting of Millais. And you can see there's a sketch, by the way, a drawing that he did of her modelling while he was sketching for the painting. The reason I've put these figures of Siddal, Dante Gabriel Rosetti, William Michael Rosetti down there is that the other problem we have is that textually the state of her poems is a mess. None of them were published in her lifetime. They all exist in multiple different manuscript fragments. Again, Serena Trowbridge has traced this very carefully. But mostly they exist, some exist in fragments in her hand, then there might be a fair copy in Dante Gabriel Rosetti, her husband's hand, and then they were edited and published long after by William Michael Rosetti, her brother-in-law. But if you look at this one poem, you can see, I think, how we can see Ophelia. This is the text as it finally ends up, as published by William Michael Rosetti. You can see Ophelia shaping her voice. Have a listen to this. A year and a day. Slow days have passed that make a year, slow hours that make a day, since I could take my first dear love and kiss him the old way. Yet the green leaves touch me on the cheek, dear Christ, this month of May. I lie among the tall green grass that bends above my head and covers up my wasted face and folds me in its bed, tenderly and lovingly like grass above the dead. Dim phantoms of an unknown ill float through my tired brain. The unformed visions of my life pass by in ghostly train. Some pause to touch me on the cheek, some scatter tears like rain. the river ever running down between its grassy bed, the voices of 1,000 birds that clang above my head, shall bring to me a sadder dream when this sad dream is dead. A silence falls upon my heart and hushes all its pain. I stretch my hands in the long grass and fall to sleep again, there to lie empty of all love, like beaten corn of grain. Now you can see how you can read that biographically, but you can also see that it's a very carefully crafted and interesting piece of art. It's a very profound, moving poem about distress, about alienation from emotions, and it picks up on all of that imagery from Ophelia, those Ophelia scenes in Hamlet, and from the painting. The tall green grasses, the floating body, as imagined, or rather the floating through the brain, the lying body, the river that runs down between the green banks, the long grass, the fading to sleep and to death. So you can see this as an intertextual engagement, maybe to understand the self, or maybe just to understand and represent the predicament of a woman alienated in love. But it's an engagement through Millet's painting, which Siddal modelled for, with Ophelia herself. Okay, I want to move on to the next brief instance, and this is from Measure for Measure rather. And this is the figure, the famous painting by Millet of Mariana in the Moated Grange, and it's a painting based on a poem by Alfred Tennyson. And Tennyson's poem Mariana, published in 1830, is itself a response to Measure for Measure. Millet has both Tennyson's poem and Shakespeare's play then in his mind as he's painting the image. So, to give you a bit of the backstory then, Mariana was betrothed to or engaged to Angelo. Angelo is a judge who's been left in charge by the Duke of Vienna and is a figure of, on the one hand, extreme moral puritanism, and on the other hand, intense moral hypocrisy. He has issued an edict imposing the death penalty for fornication, so for sex outside marriage. His own relationship with Mariana has been put on hold because her dowry that was being brought overseas by her brother sank, so she doesn't have a dowry, she doesn't have money to offer him. So she is left holed up in this kind of tower, the so-called Moated Grange, waiting, really. Meanwhile, Angelo has been asked by Isabella, who's a nun, to save the life of his brother Claudio, or to pardon her brother Claudio, who has been sentenced under this law regarding fornication. Angelo says eventually to Isabella, yes, I'll pardon your brother, but only if you sleep with me. Which, seeing as she's a nun, well, generally is horrific exploitation, but particularly given the framing of her as a nun. It's also worth saying that her brother tries to persuade her to do this. It's a play writ through with kind of moral corruption. Now, what the Duke, who's in disguise as a priest, proposes is that they arrange for a so-called classic bed trick. In other words, the substitution of Mariana, who is engaged to Angelo, loves Angelo, and crucially still intensely desires Angelo, the substitution of Mariana for Isabella. So Angelo will think that he's sleeping with Isabella, but actually will be sleeping with Mariana. So that's the kind of plot basis. Now Tennyson's poem, that's the beginning of Tennyson's poem. The whole thing, if you want to read it, is in the Norton Poetry Anthologies, which you've got for your poetry module. It's page 1032, if you have any interest in writing that down. But you can get a sense of the tone of the poem just by this first stanza. With blackest moss the flower plots were thickly crusted, one and all. The rusted nails fell from the knots that held the pair to the gable wall. The broken sheds looked sad and strange. Unlifted was the clinking latch. Weeded and worn the ancient thatch upon the lonely moated grange. She only said, my life is dreary. He cometh not, she said. She said, I am a weary. I would that I were dead. And that refrain, the last 4 lines, is repeated with slight variations throughout the poem. So there's this emphasis on dreariness and weariness, pining away, I would that I were dead. So what Tennyson does is essentially turn her into a figure of psychological isolation, physical isolation, loneliness, no obvious capacity for escape, a sense of decay all around her, the crusting of moss on the flower plots, the nails falling, breaking sheds, all of those things, the weeds. That's Tennyson's motif. But what Millais does is that he actually goes back to the Shakespeare, because Millet's Mariana is not in purely the same psychological state as Tennyson's. You can, I think, imagine her as being in that condition. One could see this as a simple treatment of the Tennyson. But Elizabeth Pretijon, who's probably the single most incisive critic on the Pre-Raphaelites in her book, The Art of the Pre-Raphaelites, points out that there is something very else going on here. This is what Elizabeth Pretijon has to say about the painting. She says that through the meticulous, almost clinical process of close looking, we encounter a scene of strange psychological and even sexual intensity. Female sexuality, Liz Pretijon suggests, seems important to this picture, but not in a predictable way. The spectator is neither enticed by a femme fatale nor titillated by a virginal girl. Indeed, the picture acknowledges the sexuality of a mature woman in a way that is difficult to reconcile with our conventional preconceptions about the Victorians. There's a little hiatus there, a lacuna, and in that, Elizabeth Pretijon offers quite an detailed reading of the picture. She points out, for example, the way in which the fabric of the dress and the way in which Mariana's pose draws attention to her body, particularly to her bottom and to her breasts. You've also got the texture of the cloth, which is this kind of richness to it, an intensity to it. She talks about the way in which the painting, again, the dress, like I said about Ophelia's dress, it's not obviously historicized. It could be Victorian, it could be earlier. It isn't the case that he's obviously doing something medieval here. So he's creating this hybridity of modernity and the past. We can view her as a modern woman, even though she's in an antique space. Elizabeth Pretijon also points out that you've got an odd combination here of reality and the imaginary. Look at the way in which she seems to have just stood up from her tapestry work, her weaving, and yet already leaves have settled on the tapestry itself. They've come in through the window. So you've got this strange sort of suspension of the instant with the eternity, or not the eternity, but the kind of continuum, the static nature of her life. Elizabeth Pretijon even does something really interesting, I think, which is she invites us as readers to kind of try out the pose, to actually sort of imagine what it feels like, to stretch your back in that way, to become aware of your body. To be so there's this consciousness of Mariana's body, not only to the viewer, but to Mariana herself. And of course, this is what we know about her from the play, which is that she is acutely aware of her own bodily impulses. She still desires. Her predominant feeling actually towards Angelo seems to be not weariness, yearning, pining, but desire. And the play will enable her to realize that desire. So you can see, I think, how Millais is pushing the boundaries of what we might expect a Victorian young man to be doing in representing women and women's sexuality. And this takes us to the last example I want to show you, which I've given this kind of deliberately, ridiculously anachronistic title to, Shipping Viola and Olivia, because I want to highlight quite how extraordinary and surprising what it is that Deverell and Tupper do in their collaborative work in reimagining the relationship between these two heroines from Twelfth Night, from the comedy Twelfth Night. So, the basic plot detail here is that Viola is in disguise as Cesario, working for Duke Orsino, and she is sent as an emissary to Olivia, who Orsino is in love with. Olivia doesn't as yet reciprocate Orsino's love, And Olivia, thinking that Cesario is male, falls in love with Cesario. That's what happens in the plot, and this has kind of comic ramifications. But this is really kind of pushed much, much further by these two Pre-Raphaelite collaborators, Tupper and Deverell. So Deverell was working on this painting, Twelfth Night, Act 2, Scene 4. And again, we have Elizabeth Siddal modelling him here as Cesario / Viola. This is Orsino. This is actually Dante Gabriel Rosetti modelling as Feste. And this is effectively a painting of unrequited heterosexual love, a kind of comedy of unrequited heterosexual love, because Viola is in love with Orsino, but he doesn't notice her. He thinks she's his manservant. And Orsino, meanwhile, is in love with Olivia, who is off scene. And actually, I think I would say that this is also very clearly a study in unrequited heterosexual love, because although Viola is in male disguise, there's no mistaking, I think, that this is a woman. We're not meant to engage in a kind of double expectation. Is this a woman? Is this a man? We're in on the joke, as it were, as of course we are in the play, because we've met Viola before she disguises herself as a man. So that's the starting point. That's Deverell's painting. But then he does an etching. So this etching appears in The Germ, which is the periodical that the Pre-Raphaelites published in 1850. It's a total flop. It only runs to 4 issues before it has to fold. But it's a very, very interesting periodical, because it's where they articulate their artistic theory. It's where they practice it through etchings and through poetry and stories, actually, too, and critical essays. Now, what you see here is a moment earlier in the play. Actually, it is earlier in the play, which is Act 1, Scene 5, where Cesario is carrying the message to Olivia. Now, Cesario asks Olivia, so Viola asks Olivia to unveil herself. And she does so. And then later, after the scene, just as Viola has gone, Olivia admits that she's attracted to him, as she thinks him to be. So Deverell has made a slight change here, in that now it is actually Viola herself who raises the veil over Olivia. And also, I think the intensity of Olivia's expression suggests that this isn't a desire she's kind of waking up to later. It's a desire that she's already conscious of at the moment of unveiling. There's a kind of confrontation in the way she's looking, a confidence too, the way she's looking at Viola. Now, I think also, this is again Elizabeth Siddal, and again it's actually the same costume. I think that he's done something quite clever in the way he shades Viola's face. It creates a degree of ambiguity. There's more of a boyishness, I think, to this pose of Viola here. And we don't know what her response is. It creates ambiguity. Maybe there's a blush colouring her cheeks here. Not quite sure. There's certainly a degree of darkness to it. Maybe that's just shade. Now, this image was paired with this poem in The Germ itself. And this is by John Lucas Tupper. When Viola, a servant of the Duke, of him she loved, the page, went, sent by him, to tell Olivia that great love which shook his breast and stopped his tongue, was it a whim, or jealousy, or fear that she must look upon the face of that Olivia? 'Tis hard to say if it were whim, or fear, or jealousy, but it was natural as what came next, the near intelligence of hearts. Olivia loveth, her eye abused by a thin wall of custom, but her spirit's eyes were clear. Clear? We have oft been curious to know the after fortunes of those lovers dear. Having a steady faith, some deed must show that they were married souls, unmarried here, having an inward faith that love, called so in verity, is of the spirit, clear of earth and dress and sex. It may be near what Viola returned Olivia. Now, what is going on here is, I think, quite extraordinary, because Tupper makes 2 radical changes to what goes on in the play. The first is that in the play, Olivia is deceived. She believes Cesario to be a man. And therefore she believes herself to have fallen in love with a man. and as she's disabused, everything kind of is cleared up. But what is suggested here is that actually, although she was superficially abused by a thin wall of custom, her spirit's eyes were clear. So it was genuinely love for Viola that Olivia was experiencing. It wasn't merely a delusion. And then secondly, he suggests that Viola returns that affection. That doesn't happen within the play. So we're getting a counter version of the narrative being imagined here. And the function of this counter version of a narrative is to imagine a scenario in which, or is to think through the possibilities of homosexual affection. To think through the idea that actually love between two women can be, and he uses the word twice to underscore it, natural. Now, if you think about Victorian expectations, partly about thinking about female sexuality at all, but also Victorian thoughts about homosexuality, which were, first of all, was very hard for Victorians to conceive. They didn't have the same language that we had, but also led to the kind of laws that led to the arrest of Oscar Wilde and so forth, the sort of attempt to sustainedly repress homosexuality. This is an extraordinarily advanced, to use an anachronistic term, but extraordinarily independent way of thinking. And it's Shakespeare that is stimulating this thinking, and it's particularly Shakespeare's heroines, and it's actually this pre-Raphaelite practice of sustained investigation. This whole poem is an investigation. Look at the way it conducts itself through questions, probing, further discussion of the point. So I hope I've shown you then that the pre-Raphaelite engagement with Shakespeare created a range of exciting, innovative works of art, but that those works of art themselves also mark sustained probing of Shakespeare's texts, how to represent Shakespeare's texts, and the psychological implications of them, and where you might take those implications, thinking about female agency, thinking about women's sexuality, thinking about homosexuality, thinking about desire, thinking about social relations between men and women and between women. If you're interested, by the way, in pursuing the Pre-Raphaelites further, I know that Rebecca Mitchell runs a third-year module on them. And as I said, there's BMAG too that is well worth visiting. You could also encounter them, I think, on the Victorian module next year. And again, if you're interested in pursuing any of this through dissertations in the longer run, feel free to get in touch. But I hope I've given you a sense of how we've got a meeting of two really important artistic moments through Shakespeare and the Pre-Raphaelites. Thanks very much.